All right, so today we are going to be putting the final touches on the Golf before it goes in for its pre-roadworthy inspection. Well, one of the last touches. Today we're going to be changing the oil, which is something I've wanted to do for a very long time. As well as that, we're also going to be changing the oil pan gasket, which has been leaking for a very long time, as well as the oil filter gasket where it connects to the block of the motor, because it's also been leaking from there. All very common fail points to start leaking oil from, and mine is doing it from both spots. So what we're going to do, I'm just going to quickly idle the car for about 5 minutes just to get some temperature into the oil, and then we're going to start by jacking up the car, supporting it with jack stands, and getting underneath to see what we're working with. Alright, so the car's now idled for about 4 or 5 minutes and the oil will be relatively warm, just enough to be a lot more free-flowing when I finally get around to draining it. Coming over here though, we have our filter for our oil, because we're going to be changing the oil and the filter today. As well as that, here is the gasket for the oil filter housing where it connects to the block, and our gasket for the sump itself. So let's jack the Golf up and get underneath it and start progress on this. All right, so here we are underneath the Golf, and we're gonna remove the oil drain plug. We're gonna drain the oil first before we start working on anything, because obviously if we were to pull the sump off, we'd make a very big mess if it's full of oil. So what we're gonna do, drain the oil into a container, and then we should be sweet to start removing these bolts, which are 5mm Allen heads. All right, so we've now got a drain pan underneath, and we're just gonna crack this loose. It's a 19mm bolt. And once we get that loose, we'll start to take this out. Hold this up so we don't spill too much oil. And of course, I'm doing this without gloves, and I'm gonna get this all over my hands. I'm gonna try really hard to do a neat job of this, but I've already covered in oil because of how much oil there is on the sump itself, but we'll try my hardest. Nearly there, nearly there, nearly there. Beautiful. Perfectly executed. Not really. I'm covered in a little bit of oil. Wow, look at the color of that. Now, the oil in this car is 12,000 kilometers, no. The oil in this car is 1,200 kilometers old, which is probably like 800 miles. But it's 15W40, and I feel like they only went to 15 weight oil because of the oil leak. It's obviously leaks a lot less when it's thicker, when it's cold. So I feel like that's why it's got such a heavyweight oil in it. I'm going to be putting 5W40 in it, a liquid moly gen. That way as well, it's got that UV in it. So if there are any oil leaks, I'll be able to spot it with a black light. So that's something I'm going to be doing. I'm going to go up and pop the bonnet now and just loosen off the oil fill cap, because we need to get some air into the motor. All right, so we're now down to the last drops of oil coming out of the motor. In a couple of seconds, I'm going to put the bolt back in and tighten it back down. And then what I'm going to do is drain the oil filter. I was going to do the drain on that, but it looks like someone's put that in with a few too many ugga-duggas, and it looks very, very stripped out. So instead, I'm just going to remove that, spill a bunch of oil everywhere. That'll get the last of the oil out of the motor, and then we're going to look at starting to remove the oil sump. So the crush washer on this looks to be basically brand new. I'd say this has been replaced when it had its oil change about 1,200 kilometers ago. So I'm just going to reuse it. Generally, you would advise to replace it. So if you are doing this yourself, replace it. But I've never had an issue reusing them before, and I'm going to continue that theme today. So we'll get that snugged up, and I will torque that down with my torque wrench. All right, so I'm just going to torque this up. Once you've done a couple of these, you'll just be able to do it by hand. Yep, that feels tight enough to me. All right, now that we've drained the oil, I'm just going to smash the bottom of the pan, just with a bit of breaking parts cleaner and a rag, just to remove some of the oil residue and other dirt left on the bottom of it. All right, so now that we've drained the oil out of the sump, it's time we move on to our oil filter. Again, this is going to be very messy because I'm doing this without draining the oil out of the filter itself first, but it's still doable this way. It's just not the best way to do it. So 36mm socket on the filter, and we'll just slowly loosen it off. Again, expect you are going to wear a lot of this oil. Alright, and now that we're about 20 minutes and halfway into our oil change, well, I decided to do step one, which is what I should have done a while ago, and put some gloves on. Let's grab our oil filter housing here and remove the O-ring from the side of it. That's really easily done with a flat bladed screwdriver. So grab a flathead screwdriver and grab this O-ring off the side of the filter. Another thing I'm going to do really quickly, break a parts cleaner, just the back. Alright, so now that we have the old filter removed, we're going to grab our new O-ring that's included with our new filter. Gonna open this up, and we're going to slide this over the top. We'll feel that seats the way around. I'm just going to use some of the old engine oil because it's only, again, 1200 kilometers old. Look at the color of it. And we just want to smear this around this gasket just to confirm we get a really nice smooth seal all the way around. From there, we're going to get our new filter. This is a Ryco filter. Here is the part number if you're interested in that. And I'm going to stick this into the filter itself. And you'll feel that nice little click at the bottom. And there we have it, that's our filter replaced. I will fill this up partially before reinstalling it in the car, but at this point, I'm still a few minutes off actually getting to put this back in the car. So I'm gonna sit this to the side. I've cleaned all the bottom off so it's not gonna drip oil everywhere, and I'm gonna just put this out of the way for the time being. All right, so looking in just there is the top of the oil filter. Those little plugs there, the two on the outside or the most forward of the car, you simply just pull up on. Pull up on by the clip though, not the actual wire. We don't want to break the wire too early. And then at the back sort of left on a driver's side on a right-hand drive car, there is one other little clip which you do have to pull tabs on to release, but that's it. Simply those three little connections on top, and they're removed. And now we're ready to start removing the three bolts that hold the filter housing itself on. So looking from underneath the car, it's very hard. But there's one bolt there, and then one more on top that holds the oil filter housing in. They're 13 mils. They're going to be a pain in the backside to do, but I'm going to remove them now, and that should release this housing, which should show the O-ring, which is being the issue, which is sort of like a figure 8 looking O-ring. All right, so I've been able to remove the top bolt. The bottom two bolts are loose and removed, but they cannot pull out. They are running into clearance issues with what looks to be one of the AC lines, but I'm hoping that this, oh, what a beautiful sight. There we go, there's our oil filter housing, and I'll show you the gasket on the back that we're about to replace, and it looks like I have the perfect match. That is super exciting. All right, so here we have the gasket here on our oil filter, and I'm guessing this is probably going to be pretty brittle. Wow, it feels solid as anything. So we have a bit of a tear in it there. I'm not sure if I just did that then, but the thing, oh yeah, actually, no, it's very, very brittle. There's cracks all around it. I've seen these come out a lot worse in other videos, but this one is definitely torn up pretty bad. So clean my hands up after that. My glove got attacked before. And now we have a fly flying around conveniently. Our new replacement O-ring right here, which should, in theory, slot straight in. It looks as though it's going to, but I'm going to quickly just clean up this surface. So I'm just using right now a screwdriver, the tip of the rag, just to get in to where the gasket sits and just clean out any dirt that's in there. Alternatively to this as well, you could just use something like a Q-tip, but this is what I have on me right now, so this is the method I'm going to go with. But that is looking absolutely 100% better than it was. So I'm gonna stick that right there in front of me, clean my hands up, and I'm gonna dip my finger in some of our new engine oil. It's getting a really solid layer of oil all around the gasket. I don't know if these do need to be pre-lubed or not, but I'm just gonna do it anyway. And then from there, we simply place it back in, and it clicks into place. Absolutely perfectly. It does have a slight raise in it, and that will compress when it's tightened back onto the block. So we've gone from this broken up and torn gasket to this brand new, non-flattened, nice new gasket, which will be ready to go back in the car and hopefully stop one of the sources of oil leaks this car currently has. All right, so the oil filter housing is now all cleaned up and we have our new gasket installed. The surface is cleaned and so is the block. We are ready to put this back into the car. So best bet is to put these bottom two screws in, seeing as we don't have enough clearance to get them in without doing it that way. We're going to put them in, line this up and start to thread them in by hand. Then from there I'm going to go up to the top, put the top bolt in and then just slowly sort of torque them down in a circle pattern, just nice and snug. All right, so there we have the housing buttoned back up there now. It's all tightened up. I've tightened it to sort of similar to how it felt when I loosened it off. I haven't torqued it up because quite frankly, I won't be able to get a torque wrench on the bottom two bolts. And the top one is in such an inconvenient spot that I just couldn't be bothered. It feels about the same as what it was before. It's probably much the same as what I would do for a sump bolt, maybe slightly less. But now that we've fixed that, that's that leak up there that should stop now. It's time we work on the gasket around the oil pan itself, because as we can see by the wet residue around it, that is another spot it's leaking oil from. So we're gonna start off by removing these two, what look to be 10mm bolts that are the shroud plate that goes on the side, I'm assuming that covers the flywheel for the transmission over here. Once that shroud is down, I think that's just all of the 5mm Allen bolts that I'm going to need to remove, and then that should be good to drop the oil pan off. It's funny now seeing this cleaned up, the oil pan has been scraped at some point in its life. Maybe this thing was static low. I highly doubt it. Google Maps tells me it sat on a street for 10 years, so regardless, we're gonna pull these two off now. I'm gonna be sort of cleaning the underside of the engine bay as well as I go, because in a roadworthy, if they see oil residue, it's probably going to fail it pretty quickly. So I'm gonna remove as much of that as I can so it looks dry as a bone underneath here. All right, so I stand corrected. These shroud bolts are an 11mm. There's only two of them, they're very small. We are leaking oil from somewhere. Oh, I'm just gonna keep going. All right, so we now have both of those 11mm bolts, and there comes that shroud down. It's full of oil. Wow. Sludgy. All right, and now that we've done that, it's time we start removing these bolts. All I'm gonna do is go around in a pattern and just loosen them all. Okay, so there we have every single one of the bolts loosened up. And now what I'm gonna do is grab a magnetic tray and just start removing these bolts and throwing them into it. All right, so we've now removed 1,000,000 bolts out of the sump, and this gasket, or the whole sump, should now be ready to come off. Of course, this is gonna be on there pretty tight, so I'm probably gonna get a flat bladed screwdriver and just pry on it a little bit without denting anything. There we have it. Conveniently managed to catch all that oil into the sump itself. Nice. There we get to see the crankshaft. All right, and there we have it. Our sump is now up with our new gasket in place. All besides one of the screws went back in perfectly, and unfortunately I have stripped one. I'm going to see if it starts to leak oil from that area. If it does, I'm going to take that screw out, tap the hole out, and put a bigger bolt in. But for the time being, that's how I'm going to leave it, just to see if it leaks or not. Regardless though, it is now time to reinstall our oil filter, and we'll fill that up with a bit of oil now before we thread it in, and then it's time to put oil in the car, and we're nearly done. All right, so here's our new oil filter. I'm not gonna fill this up super full, but I'm just gonna get some oil into it. That way we don't starve the motor too much when we start it for the first time. So our filter itself is now full, and that's slowly draining down into the bottom of the filter down here. All right, and now that that's sort of set its level, you can see some of the oil filter is now lubricated and full of oil already. Now what we're gonna do is stick this up into the car and tighten it down. All right, so here we are with the oil filter housing spot where we've just replaced our gasket, and you're gonna get a nice view of my head as I put this up and start to thread it into position. All right, and now that the oil filter is up to the O-ring, it's gonna be hard to turn by hand. So I'm just gonna do it with the torque wrench, just to finish the job off. And there we have it. We have successfully changed the oil filter gasket, the oil filter, and the engine sump. So now it's time to go up to the top and start filling the car with oil, and hopefully it's not going to leak out of that one little bolt over here, which you probably can't see, that unfortunately stripped out. Otherwise, again, I am expecting and planning to tap that out and put a bigger screw in or bolt in. But for now, short term, let's fill this up with oil, and hopefully it sounds a lot healthier. All right, so we're ready to go. With the amount of oil that's all spread around here, I'm gonna go with the no funnel gang and just send it straight in there. Now, I believe these motors take about 6 or 5.7 liters of oil or something. This is a 5 liter container, so I'm just gonna tip the whole thing in to get going. So there we have successfully put in 5 liters of oil into this thing. What I'm gonna do is just check the dipstick real quick. Obviously, I'm not expecting much at all on the dipstick, if anything. And then what I'll do is I'll lower the thing back down. Actually, I'll start it while it's in the air just to check for leaks, because we've changed a bunch of gaskets underneath. But then we'll put it back down on the ground, start it up, and we'll check the oil level. All right, so I don't know if I mentioned before on video, but the oil pickup line was absolutely full of plastic, which I'm assuming is timing chain tensioner, which makes me realize that I'm going to need to change the timing chains very soon. However, now that all that's removed, I'm curious to see if the engine idles much smoother and nicer, as well as that I had a little lifter tick before. I've got a different grade oil in, so I'm curious if that's going to help with that as well. So I'm going to start it up. I've got 5 liters in it just for now. We'll just let it run for 5 or so minutes, see if there's any leaks or anything, and with that being done, I'll then lower it down, check the oil level, and top it up accordingly until we're perfectly bang on the money. Let's start this up and see how it sounds. All right, so one last check of the dipstick, and we are absolutely perfectly on the full line. There we have a very successful day. There's no leaks underneath the car. I have found out that I may possibly need to do timing chains in the near future, which is something I kind of was expecting but hoping not to have to do. But with that being said, that's another successful day working on the Golf. We've now fixed up our oil leaks, and we're one step closer to getting this thing on the road, straight piped, and heaps of viral videos doing so. So if you guys have enjoyed this video, chuck a like on it, subscribe to my channel down below for more content on this car. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. I'm not too sure what that's going to be just yet. Possibly changing the CV boot on this, or yeah, that's most likely it, because that's the next part I think I have on the way. With that being said, I'll catch you in that video, and I'll see you then.